Hi, everyone. I'm sure a few more people will trickle in, but we're going to get started so our panel can do its thing and then go drinking afterwards. So I'm very, very excited tonight to have David Owen here, author of Green Metropolis. I know many of you read it, especially since we required it. Well, maybe not that many of you read it anyway, I don't know. But we did require it. And the reason we required it is because I think in its sort of mild-mannered way is a fundamentally iconoclastic book that in many ways speaks to everything that happens in this building, whether it's architecture, planning, preservation, or real estate development, that basically all that we focus on is about the future of cities. And I think this book is fundamentally about the future of cities in terms of what that means to the environmental movement and how the book sort of unabashedly challenges kind of sacred cows in terms of environmentalism. I think it's really interesting when you read the book that this notion of sustainability, which was, I think, maybe 10 years ago even, was kind of revolutionary, has now become almost conservative, right? And that the things that we talk about in the green movement have always almost taken on an almost religious fervor. And that what's interesting about the book is the book challenges some of that dogma and gets us to think a bit differently about it, whether it's leads or whether it's how much open space one needs around them, and so forth. And that's what I really enjoyed about it and reading it. I think it's also interesting in terms of what we all care about in this building, but especially maybe the real estate students in terms of thinking about not just green buildings, but what it means to create a greener city in terms of keeping crime low, keeping housing affordable, keeping schools great in cities, that those things actually may have as much, if not more, environmental impact than the things that are placed into individual buildings as green technology. So here's the book. It's now out on paperback. I'll do a little plug for you, David. I'm going to very quickly say that David, I think, and I think there's a fine tradition of this in urbanism, has no formal training in urbanism. He's a staff writer for The New Yorker, an extraordinary writer, has written more than a dozen books. I do want to ask you at dinner about high school, the 4 months that he spent pretending to be a high school student, and a number of other really great titles. But with no further ado, I bring you David Owen, author of Green Metropolis, Why Living Smaller, Living Closer, and Driving Less Are the Keys to Sustainability. Thanks very much, David.
Thank you. I do have sort of a miscellaneous background. I spent 4 months pretending to be a high school student, and that was a long time ago. I think if you did it now, you would be arrested as a likely sex offender. But at the time, it was just kind of a lark. And I just recently, on a New Yorker assignment, was in South America, in Bogota. And on my first day in Bogota, two women in an old Toyota drove me to the outskirts of town to an industrial park. And they're in a building that looked like a warehouse. The guy that I had come to interview shot me in the stomach with a .38 caliber revolver, and I felt like a thump in the stomach, and then nothing. Luckily, his business, which I'd come to interview him about, was making fashionable bulletproof clothing, and I was wearing one of his jackets, and it protected me from the bullet he shot me with. And I later was interviewing some engineers at DuPont, which makes the chemical company that manufactures Kevlar, which is the most widely used bulletproof material in the world. And Kevlar is interesting. Incidentally, it was invented in the late 60s by a woman who was trying to come up with a fiber that could be used to reinforce radial tires. And I spoke with her. She's still alive. She's in her late 80s. But I was speaking with these engineers, and we'd been talking on a conference call for about half an hour, and I said, so am I the only person on this call who's actually been shot in one of these things? And there was this sudden, prolonged silence, because it turns out that at DuPont, they don't shoot each other. They don't test their products by shooting each other. Or even reporters, but I enjoyed being shot, so I'm glad I didn't talk to them I'm glad I didn't talk to them until after I got home. And getting home in the airport in Bogota, they do this tremendous amount of security. You get searched over and over again. And I had my bullet and my cartridge in my laptop bag, and the guard at the plane went through everything. Didn't care about the bullet, and but asked me to turn on my camera to prove that it was just a camera. And when I did, the image that came up on the LCD was of Caballero shooting me in the stomach from 6 inches away. And the guy just waved me out of the plane. That was all he wanted to see. So life is tough there. Anyway, the how I got interested in this, my wife and I got married 33 years ago, and for the first 7 years together, we lived in a utopian environmentalist community in New York State. We had lived in a very small space, just 700 square feet. We didn't have a car or a clothes dryer or a lawn. We did almost all our shopping on foot. We didn't own a car. When we couldn't walk, we used public transit. The utopian community was, Manhattan. We lived on the Upper East Side at 69th and 2nd. When I mention this to New Yorkers, they are surprised at first. In fact, everybody's usually surprised at first, even, unless they've read my book as an assignment, which I'm pleased about. But the numbers are really compelling, and the average resident of New York City, consumes less energy than the average resident of anywhere else in the United States. The New Yorkers have the smallest carbon footprints of any Americans. They have by far the lowest rate of ownership of automobiles. 77% of Manhattan households don't own even one car. In the rest of the United States, it's not even on the same graph. In the rest of the country, we actually have in the United States 50 million more registered vehicles than we have licensed drivers. And in South Dakota, I was reading just recently, 13% of households have 5 or more cars. So New Yorkers are very different from other Americans in good ways. 82% of employed Manhattan residents walk to work or ride public transit or take a bicycle. That's 10 times the rate for the country as a whole. It's, and it's 8 times the rate for residents of Los Angeles County. The average New York City resident uses less than 5,000 kilowatt hours of electricity every year. The average in Dallas, Texas is more than 16,000. The New York City has a larger population than all but 11 states. If it were granted statehood on its own, it would rank 51st in per capita energy use. It also, New York State is 51st in per capita gasoline use entirely because of New York City. New Yorkers have the smallest carbon footprints of any Americans, just 7.1 metric tons per person per year. That's less than a third of the national average. And Manhattanites are about on a par with residents of Sweden. In 2007, Forbes assessed the 50 states for greenness and picked Vermont as the greenest in the country. Vermont has lots of trees and farms and small towns. It has no big cities. It also has lots of the things that Forbes was looking at. Lots of buildings certified by the U.S. Green Building Council's LEED program, and lots of public policies aimed at increasing energy efficiency. But in the most important ways, I think, Vermont sets a very poor environmental example, especially in comparison with New York City. It has no truly significant public transit system other than its school bus routes. It's one of the most heavily automobile-dependent states in the country. The average Vermonter consumes 545 gallons of gasoline a year, which is 100 gallons more than the national average, and way more than, like 6 times as much as the average New Yorker. The average household in Vermont consumes 7,100 kilowatt hours of electricity every year, which is more than 50% more than the average household in New York City. And Vermonters also use more water and generate more solid waste, their backyard compost heaps notwithstanding. In 1985, my wife and I moved out of New York. We moved 90 miles north, not to Vermont, but to a place very like it, to a little town in northwestern Connecticut. The house we bought was built in 1790, so it's a recycled dwelling. We live across a dirt road from a 4,000-acre nature preserve, and I see all kinds of wildlife in my yard. We felt as though we had stepped into Arcadia, and yet by almost any measure, our move was an environmental disaster. Our electricity consumption went from 4,000 kilowatt hours during our final year in New York in 1985 to almost 30,000 kilowatt hours, and we don't even have an air conditioner. We went from owning no cars when we were in New York to owning one. It seemed like a radical transformation. And then we realized almost immediately that if you have just one car, you can't go pick up your car at the mechanic when you've taken it to get the oil changed because you don't have another car to get you there. So we very quickly got a second car, and then as a result of a mild midlife crisis on my part, we ended up with a third car. And there was a friend of someone I know, when he got into his 50s, emailed a woman that he'd gone to high school with, and she emailed him back, "Why don't you just go get a car?" Then when our kids got to be 16, the third car became a necessity, and I'm ashamed to say we still have it. When people who live in the city imagine life in the country, they picture people going for long walks in the woods and gathering eggs from their own chickens and going kayaking on streams. But what you really do when you move into the country is move into your car, because there is absolutely no other way to get anywhere that you need to go. When we lived in New York, our pediatrician was in the lobby of our apartment building, just an elevator ride away. And an elevator, incidentally, is one of the most energy efficient passenger vehicles there is, because it operates partly, it's counterweighted and uses less energy. In Connecticut, my dentist is 2 towns away, a 32-mile round trip by car. When my wife and I go to a movie, we have to wait a month for it to get to our part of the world, and then it's a 20-mile drive each way. Back in the days when there was such a thing as DVDs, renting one consumed a couple of gallons of gas, because it was the nearest Blockbuster was 10 miles away, and renting one involved 2 round trips, because you had to go get it and then take it back. The difference between where we used to live and where we live now, and the reason for all these things, is density, population density, the key to New York City's sort of remarkable environmental record. Manhattan's density is 67,000 people per square mile, which is 800 times the average US density. It's 30 times LA's. It's 16 times Melbourne, Australia's. It's 5 times Chicago's. It's 1,000 times Vermont's. If you took the residents of Vermont and spread them out, or took the residents of New York City and spread them out at the population density of Vermont, you would need a land area equivalent to Vermont itself, plus Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey, and Delaware. And then, of course, you'd have to find places to put all the people that you had moved out of the way to make room for them, and build all the infrastructure that they required to support them. The reason density is important is that moving people and their destinations closer together, decreasing the distance between people and between people and the places where they go, drastically limits their opportunities for reckless consumption. It releases them from dependence on the automobile. It forces the majority of them to live in some of the most energy efficient residential structures in the world, apartment buildings or dormitories. In the rest of the country, though, the trend has been in the other direction. Since the middle of since 1950, the size of the average house, American house, has doubled, while the size of the American household has actually shrunk. In New York, the trend has gone in the other direction. The size of the average New York apartment, as I'm sure many of you are painfully aware, has actually gone down. My daughter and son now both live in New York. My daughter, for a while, lived in a studio apartment that was smaller than her childhood bedroom. When you move people close together, as you know, all kinds of good things happen. I think one of the most powerful books about the environment, even though she doesn't mention the environment at all, is Jane Jacobs's Death and Life of Great American Cities. Almost everything that she talks about that increases the vitality of urban places also makes them greener. When you move people closer together, they are able to take public transit. New York City is one of the very few places in the United States where you are likely to hear someone say, we don't have time to drive, we better take the subway. That's a sentence that has never been uttered in the rest of the United States. New York City is probably the largest place in the United States where walking for many people is their primary mode of transportation. I got here a little bit early and walked down Broadway and back just to fill the time. And in a half an hour, I'm sure I walked within 50 feet in either direction of more human beings than anybody who lives in my town for the next 50 years would, just in the course of their life. It's an extraordinary richness of people. I was at a conference in New York City several years ago where I was sort of laying out this basic idea. The person had asked me about it, and I said that I thought that New York City was the greenest place in the United States, and for these reasons having to do with density. And he said, but that's just because they're all crammed together. And I said, well, yeah, that is it. That's the explanation. And he said, but it's all unconscious. And I think this is what drives people in Portland insane when you talk about really New Yorkers have a smaller carbon footprint than people in Portland, Oregon do, despite the windmill on that building in downtown Portland. And the reason is that for New Yorkers, it's unconscious. No one is more surprised than a New York City resident to be told that he or she deserves a gold star, a LEED platinum beanie hat for the way they just live as a matter of course. But unconscious greenness is the best kind because you don't have to enforce it. The low energy use, the low carbon output, the constrained environmental impact of New York City residents is structural. It's just a result of the way they've chosen to live. And that, ideally, as we try to think about global solutions to these tremendous environmental problems that we face, is huge. Ideally, you want to create environments in which people have no choice but to live the way we want them to live. And the great thing about New York is that even New Yorkers who think that global warming is just a left-wing crock, nevertheless have small carbon footprints. Actually implementing solutions to our environmental solutions of any kind, though, is tricky. I think in the first 8 years of the 21st century, it was very easy to be a purist on environmental matters because for the 8 years of the George Bush administration, there was virtually no chance that any green initiative was going to be enacted. Since then, it's been more difficult because I think with Obama's election, there was a feeling among a lot of people that now finally we'd be able to take some action on the environment. And what has happened is that we have had to confront the divisions, the real divisions that underlie many of these issues. And I think that in the past few years, despite what people say, the big conflicts have not been between climatologists and deniers, for example, but between environmentalists and environmentalists. And you see it right here in New York City. There's a battle brewing right now between the city, which is created what I think are terrific bike lanes that move the curb out, thereby not only creating a non-suicide zone for bicycle riders, but also beneficially sponging up space for automobiles. But Brooklyn residents have objected to the loss of that traffic space, not appreciating the environmental value of traffic congestion, which I'll talk about in a little while. Elsewhere, some of we see it right now regarding nuclear power and the tragedy in Japan that has highlighted that. You could make quite a wall chart comparing editorials from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal on this subject, but there are environmentalists on both sides of the issue, whether this proves that we must never even think about nuclear energy, to environmentalists who say this proves that even with this disaster, that we must think about nuclear power, because even with a tragedy on this scale, relatively few people have actually been killed by the semi-meltdown at the nuclear power plants in Japan. There are right-thinking people on both sides of that issue, as there are on solar. The recent proposals to build utility-scale solar emplacements in the desert in California were defeated not by climate deniers, but by environmentalists. Similarly, with the proposal to build the nation's first large offshore wind facility in Nantucket Sound off of Nantucket. That project has been delayed for a decade and may be delayed forever, and there are environmentalists on both sides of that issue. So these issues are tough, and it's been clear for a long time that there are no easy answers to them. The question is whether there are even hard ones. In New York City in 1999, what was called the first green building in New York City was constructed in Times Square, at 4 Times Square. It's the Condé Nast building. The Durst organization built it. It's where my employer currently has its offices. It has many ostensibly green features. There are collection chutes inside for recyclable materials. In the restrooms, the glass dividers are made of recycled glass. There are photovoltaic panels built into the skin of the building. There are natural gas-fired absorption chillers that provide heating and cooling. There's an advanced, at that time, in 1999, curtain wall construction method that had exceptional shading and insulating properties. And there's a fuel cell generator that's on the roof of the building. In terms of that building's true ecological impact, though, all these and other overtly green innovations are decidedly beside the point. The photovoltaic panels, for example, that are described as providing less than 1% of the building's electric power, and less than 1% is usually a euphemism for 0%, which I think is what the case is there. They're for show, as is often the case. I just the other day had a telephone call from someone who was was very interested in getting, how do we get solar panels onto buildings in New York City? And it's, in terms of harvesting the sun, New York City is probably not a good place to do it. And yet, it doesn't mean that New York City, that building is not a green building, or that New York City is not an environmentally valuable place to have a building. The 2 greenest features of 4 Times Square are ones that most people never mention. They are the fact that it's big and that it's in Manhattan. The tall buildings, for example, help to create the very concentrations of humanity that make all the benefits of density possible. One of the most interesting things about 4 Times Square is that it is I believe it's a 1.2 million square foot building. 6,000 people work in it, and yet it doesn't have a parking lot. The architect, Bruce Fowle, who worked on that project, told me if you sliced it up into 60 typical one-story industrial park American corporate buildings, each one surrounded by a parking lot in an industrial park out on an interstate exit someplace, you would hugely multiply the environmental impact of the people who are working there, even though you might easily be certified platinum by LEED. As a result of that, of where that building is situated, 95% of the people who work in it arrive either on foot or by bicycle or by public transit. In fact, I think if I were going to create a rating system for buildings, I would create one that measured only the sort of life cycle energy consumption and carbon output of the people who use the building. I would be unconcerned about any of the building's features, but would look at what do they consume during the workday and what do they consume coming to and from work. And I think there's probably almost any building in New York City can beat almost any building in most other parts of the country just on that alone. Recently in the little town, Connecticut town where I still live, somebody I know just built the first LEED platinum house in Connecticut. It's on 13 acres of former farmland. It's 6 miles from the nearest supermarket. The residents of it are entirely dependent on cars because there's, as is true of me, there's no place that they can get without wheels. There's no way that there's anybody who lives in New York City is greener than the residents of that LEED platinum house. We are good at kidding ourselves, however, about what actually makes us green. There was a television commercial a few years ago for the Toyota Prius, and you've probably seen it. A Prius drives into a colorless landscape. It's just bleak, colorlessness stretching forever. But as the Prius drives by, everything bursts into bloom. There are children who have flower petals emerge around their heads. There are other children with butterfly wings who are hovering above them. There's beautiful music plays. There's rainbows in the background. I have a friend who bought a Ford Fusion, which is another hybrid car, and he took me for a ride in it. And as we drove around, and he employed such energy-saving techniques as avoiding jackrabbit starts and braking gently. In the odometer, in the fuel gauge, little green foliage sort of intertwined itself to show that he was behaving in an environmentally responsible manner. It was kind of measuring the environmental benefits that we were apparently dispensing from the tailpipe as we drove around. And I have a college degree, and yet I felt virtuous, as though we really were actually doing something good for the earth. Kind of vacuuming bad things from the atmosphere. I gave a talk in Australia last summer on global warming, and one of the great, I think, ironies of this, and even more as I sort of probe the depths of hypocrisy of my own life, is what possible environmental value there was of transporting me and my golf clubs halfway around the world to give a 45-minute talk on the environment. I don't know. But if you are a connoisseur of big carbon footprints sometime, check out the book tour itineraries and frequent flyer mile balances of just about any environmental expert whose name you recognize. But at any rate, while I was there playing golf with a local Melburnian, he asked me what I was doing, and I told him, and he asked me what I was going to be speaking about. And when I began, he stopped me very quickly and said, "Just tell me what to buy." He said, if you want me to drive a different car, tell me. I'll buy it. You want different kitchen counters, I'll get them. Just tell me what to buy. And as I laugh too, and yet I think, that's pretty much the way we all think about these things. We think about sustainability as a matter of product substitution. We will continue as we are, but with I'll get a different phone, I'll get a different car, I'll change the windows in my apartment, but beyond that, not. Almost all of the measures that we discuss are actually sort of lifestyle upgrades in disguise, and I think cars are a good, driving is a good example where almost everything that we talk about in terms of putative environmental benefits actually, for some reason, makes driving more appealing and more convenient and less expensive for us. Cars that are more fuel efficient. We talk about eliminating traffic congestion. What we're really talking about is sort of lifestyle upgrades, which we then package in our own minds as gifts to humanity. I have a 2-slide PowerPoint presentation, which I forgot the slides for, but I've often given it without the slides. I just used my laser pointer, but I also forgot my laser pointer. So I will give it without either the slides or the laser pointer. But anyway, the first slide was created in 1999 by the Tampa Transit Authority. It's a typical suburban street. It's 4 lanes of automobiles, bumper to bumper, as far as you can see from top to bottom. It's a posed photograph, but you've seen it. It's a completely typical scene anywhere in the United States. The second slide, over on the other side of my book jacket over there, is all the all the occupants of the cars in this slide sitting in folding chairs in the middle of the same street. And as you'll see in the second slide, there's this huge number of cars over here, and all the occupants of those cars squeezed down to a space just like this. You could fit them in the back half of a New York City bus. It's tiny, and whenever I show these 2 slides together, people immediately, they laugh. It seems ridiculous that we have this many cars to move this tiny number of people. And I've been thinking about these issues for a long time, but it still surprises me, and when I drive along on I-684, for example, as I did this afternoon as I was burning lots of gasoline to come here to talk to you, I sometimes mentally superimpose this image over the traffic and realize that this sea of cars actually reduces down to a very, very small number of people being moved around by all this technology. And those 2 slides together make the point that the Tampa Transit Authority wanted them to make, which is that individual SUVs are a ridiculous way to move people around. But if you are one of the drivers in the car in this traffic jam over here, and you look at this slide over here, what you see is nirvana, because your commuting problem is gone. All those cars that were in the way, that were blocking your path to work, that were making it impossible for you to drive the speed limit to get to work, they're gone, and driving is a pleasure again. And this is the sort of the core problem that's at the heart of so many of the environmental solutions that we talk about, which is that we sometimes have the courage to say, this is a crazy way to move people around, we need to build a transit system, but we seldom then have the courage to take the next step, which is to say, once we've built the transit system, we have to make people use it, and not only that, we have to make it impossible for them to take advantage of the fact that we've removed cars from the roads, and we have to take traffic space away. It's much harder to do that part. It's hard to do both parts, but it's especially hard to do the second part. A couple of years ago, I wrote a long op-ed piece for the Wall Street Journal in which I made the case that traffic congestion has environmental value and used New York City as an example. The reason is that I would say is that it's not traffic congestion that's an environmental problem. It's traffic that's an environmental problem. Congestion is a driving problem, and anything that makes driving a problem has environmental value because it makes people less likely to do it. The reason New York City residents don't have cars is that you'd have to be insane to have one. It costs you a fortune and you can't get anywhere in it. We cannot make our driving problem go away by simply making it easier for people to get around in their cars. But that's a tough one. I'm going to drink some of this water. The extent of our problem, and the reason it's difficult to address any of these issues on almost any level, was brought home to me during the BP oil crisis in the Gulf. While the oil was spewing from the ocean floor, there were people who I knew who were given actual nightmares by the scenes that you would see on TV of the oil gushing from the bottom of the ocean, just completely unconstrained into the sea. And there's actually a website, it's still up, where you can go and you can maneuver around a BP-sized oil blob, and you can place it anywhere in a Google map, and you can just about completely blot out the state of Virginia, for example, with that blob. The BP oil well spewed an extraordinary volume of oil into the Caribbean, or the Gulf of Mexico. It was 55,000 barrels a day. But 55,000 barrels a day is what we Americans use every 4 minutes in our lives. The entire 87-day spill volume from that broken well, the world uses every hour and a half. If the world's entire oil consumption were spewing into the ocean, our entire oil consumption, it would be the equivalent of 1,400 BP oil spills gushing all the time, around the clock, 365 days a year. There was a piece in the Onion last year that was something like it was like global environmental calamity, oil tanker safely arrives in port. So I can't remember what it exactly was. So in the face of all that, it's very easy to look busy on all these environmental issues. And those of you who are in real estate or who are architects will find it extremely easy to look busy. It's possible you can put all sorts of gadgets on a building. You can give it green credentials. You can win LEED certification. What's harder is to confront the real underlying issues and to look and see how we actually make differences in the way we live. And today I don't have any, this is like one of those blue book things where you write time across the end of it before you get to what's supposed to be your conclusion. So I always tell people that I'm on the problem committee, not the solution committee. But at any rate, I wrote a profile of an Australian engineer named Saul Griffith in the New Yorker a couple of years ago. And Griffith has given talks in which he, for example, has spoken while an IV bag was dripping oil at the rate that the average American consumes it, which is about a pint an hour. But he has estimated that the world currently consumes energy at a rate of approximately 16 trillion watts, 16 terawatts, which is the equivalent of 160 billion 100-watt light bulbs burning all the time. If we were to be able to cap greenhouse gases at the level of 450 parts per million, which is about 15% higher than where we are right now, and which is a level that some scientists have said would be consistent with holding global average temperature gain, so about 2 degrees Celsius. Doing that would necessitate holding global energy consumption at its current rate, despite a global population that is projected to rise by the equivalent of between 6 and 7 times the current population of the United States between now and mid-century. but holding it at its current rate, and then replacing all but 3 of those 16 terawatts over the next 25 years with energy generated from a combination of the most promising renewable and non-carbon-based sources. Photovoltaics, solar thermal, wind, biofuels, geothermal, and nuclear fission. In doing that, Griffith has estimated, would require building between now and 2035 the equivalent of all of the following: 100 square meters of new solar cells, 50 square meters of new solar thermal reflectors, and 1 Olympic swimming pool's volume of genetically engineered algae for biofuels every second for the next 25 years, 1 300-foot diameter wind turbine every 5 minutes, 1 100-megawatt geothermal-powered steam turbine every 8 hours, and 1 3-gigawatt nuclear power plant every week. Such a construction program, he says, is at least theoretically feasible, but we're not making any progress on it, not making rapid progress on it. In fact, his numbers, I haven't had to change his numbers in 2 years. We still have the same 25-year requirement. In the United States, for example, just to use the nuclear example, there's a lot of debate about should we build more nuclear power plants or not. In fact, the last time we began construction on a nuclear power plant was in the 1970s, so it's not, it's not really a hot topic, I guess I would say. Instead, we have a tendency to, as I said before, to do things that look good and don't necessarily accomplish anything. I just recently was in the city to speak on a panel at the Museum of the City of New York where the topic was, is locavorism good for the environment? And naturally I took the contrarian position and said that it's not. But the reason I said that is that the distance that a food item travels is of minimal, between farm and fork, is of minimal environmental significance. The real impact comes from how the food was grown, how we prepare it. Many times we use many times the amount of energy in preparing food in our own homes that is used to transport it to us, of far greater environmental significance than food miles is what I would call grocery store miles, which is how far you live from a grocery store. Because if you live within walking distance of a grocery store, you can, at least in theory, live without a car. This is the reason that Manhattanites are able to live without cars, and also the reason that Brooklynites often are not. It has to do with how far they have to go to the grocery store. Yet we tell ourselves that we are making a valuable contribution to humanity by eating food that was grown not very far away from us. My New Yorker colleague Susan Orlean has written about raising chickens, and which is I think the most peculiarly popular hobby to have arisen in a long time. Susan drives individual hens to the veterinarian, and that fact alone gives her eggs a carbon footprint that is probably beyond our ability to measure. There's a film about Portland, Oregon, in which a woman and her small child drive to a farm beyond the city's urban growth boundary in order to buy organic vegetables from a farmer just beyond, and she picks up 2 grocery bags of vegetables and takes them back. But her drive is 25 miles in each direction, and she's in a minivan, and if all our food came to us 2 bags at a time in minivans, we would have exhausted the world's supply of fuels long ago. Food is a very emotional topic. My wife has written cookbooks. She says that we tend to define ourselves by what we refuse to eat, not just in our culturally or by religion, but also personally. We won't eat meat. We won't eat factory farm food. We won't eat shellfish. If you're my nephews, when you were little, you would not eat hot foods that are mixed. No touching foods of different varieties. No lasagna or spaghetti. One way to see the sort of flaws in the locavorism argument is to think about agricultural products that we don't eat, and cotton is an example. You'll often hear people say we should be wearing more cotton, less clothing made from petroleum, and probably we should. But I don't think anyone would make the argument that it would make sense that we should wear only cotton clothing that's grown within 50 or 100 or 200 miles of where we live. Growing cotton, even in circumstances that are ideal for the growing of cotton, involves huge amounts of, huge inputs of water and fertilizer and pesticides. And when you try to grow it in areas that are not ideally suited to it, all those requirements go up, as do the requirements for land. It's a poor use of arable land to do that in places where it doesn't make sense to do it. And that's the difficulty with taking a simplistic view of all these tremendously difficult environmental issues that face us. I think the key to thinking about sustainability is to acknowledge that it's not a micro problem, it's a macro problem. There's no such thing as a sustainable building, no such thing as a sustainable appliance, no such thing as a sustainable car. The only way that sustainability makes sense to think about is of all these things working together. How do we, 7 billion and counting, find a way to carry on in something that we recognize as a good way to live? And that's a difficult one. I saw someplace a professor who had said that the sustainable human population of the earth was 1.5 billion people living as subsistence farmers, which is a very unappealing picture. 1.5 billion is about the population of the earth in 1900, when my grandmother was 5 years old. And you think, well, that sounds sort of feasible, but then you think of all the people you have to get rid of in order to get down to that number, and it's not an appealing picture for any of us. And I think that that's the reason that density is such an important tool, and because it is an unconscious generator of environmental benefits, and that I would urge all of you who I think in one way or another are involved in creating the human living environments, that the important issues are how we arrange people, and not so much the gadgets and gizmos that go on the skins of those buildings. Even though I think it's also probably going to be hard to make a living if you don't embrace the lead religion, if that's where you are. But that's another problem for the solution committee that I don't have anything to do with. Anyway, I think we're going to have a discussion, and which I'm looking forward to. Anyway, thank you.
Tell me what to buy. I'm going to really remember that story. That's incredible. Thank you, David. That was great. And now we're going to have a little panel discussion with some familiar faces, neither of whom is Lori Hawkinson, which is listed on the poster. Sorry about that. Lori couldn't make it, but we have two great panelists. Charlotte Mathews, who many of you know already, and a colleague and friend who's the head of sustainability for the related companies. And it's hopefully going to be the provocateur here, right, as we talk about some of this. And Charlotte has been very involved with the Real Estate Board of New York, with the green building codes in New York City, has an environmental science degree from Brown, has a construction management background from Bovis, as well as her time at Related. So I think she's going to bring a great perspective. My dear friend Gregg Pasquarelli, who almost needs no introduction in these halls. Right, she's not Lori Hawkinson, doesn't have the hair. Obviously, the founding principal of Shop Architects, 1996, a victim of this school. Have more projects to mention than I can mention here, but Barclays Center at Atlantic Yards, the East River Waterfront, the Innovation Hub, what is it? The Innovation Hub Government Complex, that's what it's called in Botswana. South Street Seaport, and the headquarters for Google. they've won more awards than I can mention here, has more titles. Actually, it's a little crazy. So I'm just going to end it there and go on to our discussion. Thanks.
No, but, well, you know, the question that kept probing my mind is the human factor, and that you have, despite writing this book, made the conscious decision not to move to Manhattan, and you quite rightly are on the problem committee rather than the solution committee. You know, can you talk, I mean, it's a place to be, but it's not a very comfortable place to be. So what are some of your suggestions, I guess, to the group as a whole about how to contribute towards the solution? And I think there's some recognition that the solution is just to kind of extend our well-being, you know, retain as many resources as we can for as long as we can.
Yeah, I think it's hard. And first deal with the first issue is which is why I continue to live where I live, and I have only weaselly answers to that question, but I think it's it points up a critical issue, which is that how do we move this huge ship that is our country? I think most people are like me. I'm not going to leave. My wife and I have friends that we've made for 25 years where our children grew up. I'm an elected official in my town. Any solution that involves, for example, bulldozing metropolitan Atlanta and building something more sensible, or taking people from metropolitan Las Vegas and moving them to New York City is unlikely to work. The United States is a tough nut, and I'm not exactly sure what the answer is. I think one interesting thing is that in 2008, we saw something that not even the most optimistic environmentalist in the world would have anticipated, which was an actual global drop in energy use and carbon output. And the reason was the steep price and the rise of oil, plus the implosion of the global economy, both of which had caused energy use and carbon output to fall. No one would ever advocate global economic implosions, but from an environmental point of view, they have things to be said for them. People who are out of work or afraid they're going to be out of work don't drive as much. They turn down their thermostats. They stop heating their swimming pool. They stay at home brooding, and their carbon footprint shrinks. But the challenge is how do we gain the benefits of that without the human suffering that goes along with it? There are large parts of the world where people should be using far more fossil fuels than they do. We should be making it possible for them to burn things. And then there are other parts of the country, here, Australia, Canada, where the big three of global piggishness, we have to find a way to turn it the other direction. And I don't know, that's as close as I can come to an answer to that. So I think that from the point of view of people in this room, there has to be this country, the population of our country has been projected to grow by 100 million between now and mid-century. And that is amazing if you think about it. That's to grow by the current population of New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Boston, San Francisco, LA, and the next 200 largest American municipalities. The current populations, we're going to increase by that much. That's huge if we actually do that. How are we going to do it? I think we need to find ways to encourage the growth to take place in ways that are less damaging, which would mean, I think, starting in centers of density and making them denser and working out from there, rather than doing what we've done for the past 100 years, which is to go to the edges and push farther out.
Well, I think David just told you why it's important to be in real estate.
Yeah, that's true.
But, first of all, I thought the talk was amazing. And I mean, it's a lot of things that we think about in our office and that we don't have all the statistics to back it up. But when you really think about it, it's a question of scale. And I think that one thing that's really important is, I think one thing that we do as designers or builders or developers or writers, it's about education in a way. It's about just explaining to people things that they don't understand or realize. You know, I think we all know a lot of people that think it's better to have a nice warm fire than to run a oiled, you know, an efficient oil gas furnace in their house. And of course, burning a fire is one of the most environmentally disastrous things you can do, you know, on a holiday evening. It's an incredible pollutant. It's more than running, what, like 6 diesel buses day and night for a week, one fire. And I think that these things are incredibly important. I think that everyone has a huge responsibility to educate their clients, educate the people that they're working with, and to get it out. And whether it's through writing or developing or designing or educating, if you will, it's a message of understanding the scales that you're talking about. And the phrase that we've coined at SHOP is sustainable bling, right? Like, hanging sustainable bling all over your building does not make it sustainable. Right? I mean, when I hear Julia Roberts just built a 14,000 square foot LEED platinum house in Malibu, I want to shoot myself, right? It's just, you know, and you can't.
And yet we need clients.
We do need clients, but I think but part of our responsibility is to get our client to not build a 14,000 square foot house.
Right. No, I think that's true. And I think also one of the tremendous advantages that New Yorkers have, I think that somebody who lives in New York doesn't necessarily even know what the price of oil is in terms of their daily life, unless they fly a lot, maybe. When in summer of 2008, I got a 350-gallon delivery of home heating oil at $5 a gallon, I knew exactly what the price of oil was. And I think one of the answers to my living where I live is the crisis, the steadily ratcheting up crises that we're going to face. I'm going to feel much more as I hang on to my lifestyle in the country than people who live in cities are. So as a way of sort of future-proofing yourself, there are ways of doing that are different. My wife and I, our own little ways. We actually did I think we're the only people I know of who did a major remodeling project to make our house smaller. We got rid of the whole third floor of the house as a thing to heat, because we didn't want to sell the house. We had our offices up there. Now our kids are gone, so we moved our offices down. We took the heat out. We took some dormers off the house that had been added in the 1940s and had nothing to do with the house. And so it's actually a smaller living envelope. But I think that's the kind of sort of thing you're driven to in the suburbs, whereas people in the city, life will go on. On the other hand, urban density makes catastrophes more efficient too. The tsunami and earthquake in Japan would have had far fewer casualties if the focus had been in a sparsely populated area. So there's plenty of downsides to urban life.
Go ahead. You know, when you were talking specifically, I think it was the Condé Nast building, there was one thing. I mean, you spoke about the connection to transportation, but it was almost as an aside. I mean, I think that there's something incredibly important about transportational infrastructure and putting as much density as close to it as possible as being the critical thing. I mean, it's not only that it was big, but and that people could walk to it or take transportation, but it was also that it's in Times Square. Right, and I think that that's something that we also have to think from a planning perspective, from a design perspective. It's just whenever there's that moment where there's that infrastructure, that's where the 50, 70, 100-story buildings need to go, and then surrounded by forests, in a way.
Right. I think it's true. And I think it's sort of interesting that I've been thinking of the Sierra Club as a malignant for environmental force. And the reason is that the Sierra Club has always sort of vilified urban life, and the idea is that it's a disease that we have to escape. And I think it's partly responsible for the desire that people have to live the way I live, which is you feel that your life is not authentic unless you're in direct contact with the natural world. And so I think that more than I think that is probably the engine that propels Sprawl. We all want our little piece of green. We all want our direct, intimate contact with it, and when other people follow us, we move farther along. So I think what we need is a kind of a Manhattan Club that just turns the same environmental problem inside out and say, how do we make this more benign form of human organization more appealing and as authentic as we claim that and it's tough with some. I think, when my wife and I were young, it was a great place to live. My kids are in their 20s now. They both live in Manhattan and they love it. My mother's in her 80s. She lives in an assisted living facility that's like Manhattan. She walks to her meals and she lives in a small space. College kids live like Manhattanites, even if they're not in Manhattan. They don't have cars. They engage in lots of low energy, low impact activities like incredibly tedious bullshit discussions and having sex, which all have very low environmental impact. It's the people, it's sort of the demographics in between. It's people when they start young families that are the problem. And so I think that is it was something that Vishaan mentioned earlier, which is in a place like New York, I think the critical environmental issue is not like solar panels on buildings. It's how do we make the schools something that people don't want to flee? How do we bring the noise level down so that people aren't being driven crazy by where they live? And so those things become environmental issues here in a way that they're not in other places.
David, Charlotte, can you hand me one of those plastic bottles of water, please?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So.
Oh, I thought you were going to use it as your
No,
example.
And another thing.
No, not it.
Petroleum-based.
I'm just wondering, in terms of urban policy, so once you get to the point where we're big and we're dense and we've got mass transit, 4 Times Square, is there anything inherently wrong once you've got the big dense building in Manhattan on top of all the mass transit to then lower its carbon footprint, right? Or, I know in the book you talk about congestion pricing and you kind of, and just plan on NYC generally, and I think you have some criticisms about it. And I understand your point about, well, if you keep the congestion, you disincentivize driving, and therefore, that's environmentally a better thing. But there's also other ramifications to that. Congestion in Manhattan, we have one of the strongest child asthma rates in the country, for instance. Or, there's a huge business productivity loss, right, in Manhattan because of the numbers of people who drive in from Brooklyn and Queens and so forth. And so there are other sort of mitigating factors when you look at urban policy that you could say that if you enacted some of this policy, the city becomes a more attractive place to live, therefore attracting more people to it, therefore, doing what you're saying.
Yep.
And so I'm just trying to, in terms of, I guess I'm back in the solutions department, but I'm just trying to understand kind of how to navigate that and your thoughts in terms of how you think about this.
No, I think you're right, and but I think that the challenge is how you keep the environmental benefits without or how you address these without losing the environmental benefits. You don't want to make the streets empty, because then you give people an incentive not to take the subways, or you have cars moving so fast that it becomes a danger to you as a pedestrian. I think the thing to do is that's why I like those bike lanes. They shrink they do the thing that the Brooklyn residents are complaining about. They increase congestion, but they do it at a lower traffic volume. They reduce the number of cars, and in doing that, they don't eliminate the disincentive to drive. So I think that's what you sort of do, steadily shrink the space that you allow to cars, so the number of cars goes down, the emissions go down. You can be as we should increase the the controls that we have on emissions from cars. Cars could be equipped with a device that makes them the engine shut off when they come to a stop, the way golf carts do. The engine just shuts off, and then when you step on the gas again, it comes on. So you can eliminate all these things without making driving more attractive. I think the greenest car would get about 5 miles to the gallon. It wouldn't have a heater or an air conditioner or a radio. You'd be able to drive yourself to the hospital, but you would never go down and say, let's jump in the car and just drive around aimlessly, listening to, having an NPR moment while we figure out where we're gonna go for dinner. We tend to think of it the other way, and we're constantly trying to make our lives easier, and telling ourselves that we're solving our problems when in fact we're solving completely different problems. So I think that, but you're right, you want to keep the good things, all the good things about New York. What's interesting, and I think what is tough, and I'm sure you've seen this in your work, which is that if you look back through the history of urban planning, it doesn't have a very good record. I think almost all the urban planning triumphs, or many of them, are things that happened accidentally. Manhattan is the way it is because it was on an island. Many of the sort of monstrosity, the most un-Manhattan-like parts of Manhattan represent the very best thinking of urban planners at the time that they were executed. There have been a lot of bad ideas that get done, and I think we're probably seeing a lot of that right now. And that goes back to what you were saying about adding the bells and whistles to buildings. You get a huge, what you don't want to, you don't want to add so much cost to a building that you eliminate another advantage of living there. New Yorkers now already pay more for electricity than anybody else in the country. That doesn't make any sense. We want people to be using power here because they use less of it for their activities. So we don't want to make, it's like putting skinny people on diets. I think we should focus our efforts on other places we want to make it easier for people to live in this way, as you say. Anyway.
Well, I'm firmly in the solutions department because, to quote Auden Schindler, who gets some mention in your book, from the Aspen Ski Company, he and I met and I said, do you think we're going to win this? And he said, absolutely not. But, when the sea levels rise and the air's all polluted, I want to know that I contributed towards prolonging that, and I want to go down kicking and screaming, and by the way, the fight's kind of fun. So to that point, in terms of sort of what your takeaway directives that I'm hearing is, as a developer, focus on infill, try and make density attractive to attract people such as yourself, so that they want to live in New York or similar like dense environments. But then why you would focus on greening a building once you've made it this appealing place that they want to come and live? I would argue because even if we had everyone living in New York, we still would have this incredible carbon problem because there's so much inefficiency. And this isn't, there is no silver bullet to all of this. It's about, people of a wealth of different interests, artists and writers and all the rest of it, and they all have different demands and desires, and trying to get each one of them to walk towards a more sustainable lifestyle, and then making the buildings steadily more sustainable themselves. Related has now got one of the most energy efficient buildings built during the recession. First project, they say, that actually improved its energy performance while going through value engineering as opposed to reducing it, because the scrutiny of looking at the costs of energy efficiency actually showed its cost savings and its value. And at the end of it, it's only 20% better than ASHRAE, and everyone's saying, well, we got to get to 100%, we got to get to net zero, and it's like, well, goodness, we felt pretty proud for 20%, but it's that steady improvement. So that's my sort of.
Yeah. No,
the concern is I don't want people to feel self-satisfied that they came to New York and therefore they're part of the solution, because you're not as great a part of the problem, but there's still work we can all do.
Right, we're still Americans. There was a study at MIT that the average American homeless person uses more energy than the average resident of the world. The study was sort of phony, but the number is probably, the metaphorical point is probably a decent one. So it's hard for, just as Americans, that we've had a pretty good run using all of the world's resources, and as a result, we have. It is a problem. We've kind of built the infrastructure we have built does not easily scale down to anything that you could even persuade yourself is sustainable. So it's tough.
No, it's the opposite, actually. I just came from India yesterday, and we have very much the reverse problem, which is now everyone wants to use those resources even more.
Yeah.
So I thought we should maybe open it up to some questions and let other people in on it. So yes.
Oh, yep. I guess I'm skeptical about technology's ability to save us. And the thing I was thinking recently is that environmental problems innovate too, and they typically have better funding than environmental solutions. And the very same kinds of brilliant people who are working on technological solutions to our environmental problems are also working on making those problems worse. And I think, the very same technologies that enable us to get more work from a unit of energy also enable us to extract more energy that we, more fossil fuels that we didn't even know were there 10 years ago, like the situation we now have with natural gas. The problems don't sit still while we devise solutions to them. So I think that ultimately technology is it's wrong to think that technology is going to save us. There are lots of really interesting technologies, but it's unlikely that there's a beautiful solution just lying out there. I know a physicist who is working on solar, on photovoltaics, and another physicist who's working on nuclear fusion. The physicist who's working on nuclear fusion said that he's pinning all his hopes on solar, and the physicist who's working on solar said he's pinning all his hopes on nuclear fusion. And I think that's fairly common. Saul Griffith, the Australian engineer I mentioned, is a brilliant engineer, but doesn't believe in that our solutions are technological. He believes that what we need is a huge, unprecedented behavior change, human race wide. And the example he gives is that each of us should be issued at birth a Rolex watch and a Mont Blanc pen and told, this is it, keep them nice because you're not getting another one. And he has an example that his wife hates, which is he says that his ideal activities were prostitution and drug use because they're both high cost, low energy activities with small carbon output. And like you inject yourself with an expensive drug and then nod off and are an environmentally neutral factor until you wake up again. And so what we tend to do instead is to, you can see why his wife hates both the examples. What we tend to do instead is to when we become more efficient in things, we reinvest our efficiency gains in more activities. We don't knock off once we hit the lifestyle that our parents had in the 1950s. We take our technology gains and we invest them in making our cars way more and go faster rather than, the modern automobile is extraordinarily energy efficient, staggeringly energy efficient. We've just invested that efficiency in making them weigh much more and go faster and show us movies while we drive.
If I could take a stab at that question too, I think the greatest technology advancement for buildings are things that meter consumption and then bill people for them. And it's going back to this behavior concept on one hand that I'm a very good environmentalist when I have to pay for things. I save energy in my home extremely well. I don't save it as well at the office where I don't pay. But that said, taking that a step further, people with lack of information come up with great assumptions about what is energy efficient or what is water efficient and get those radically wrong. In the same way that without all the data we're collecting about cities, we wouldn't know that New York had a lower carbon footprint than per capita than Vermont. So the more that we actually measure, to the extent that we can, sort of reality, and then feed that back to people and to inform planning and all those things, I think that's where technology is getting to currently. The other side of that is that one of the ways that we saved money in the recession on our redesign of our building was taking mechanical rooms where we had this mixed-use project. So the hotel had a mechanical room and the rental and the condo. And we realized we could save a whole lot of embodied energy and cost by consolidating that and then metering the consumption of each of those parties. And now we're taking that into sort of bigger infrastructures and down to restaurants. Could all of that grease go into one pot and then pull that out for biofuel production, but each person has to pay for what they put in that pot? So metering.
the solution that you describe, is that just a smart meter, or is a smart meter controller the one that is actually reduce waste of electricity?
Well, I was speaking more generally just about metering in general, or anything that measures consumption and then has the capability to tie into some sort of highly technical computer
So
that then could
it's just
allocate
like it's
cost.
just statistic and information. It's not something that saves the waste that you have.
Right, because information then can be used towards behavior change or towards informing decisions and such.
Okay.
Other questions? Julie? We're going to get a defensive Portland.
You are. I'm going to, I guess, in the spirit of sustainability, recycle a story that you told about the chick, your friend or colleague's chicken.
Yep.
And there's no doubt that Purdue chicken factories are incredibly efficient, right? And that the carbon footprint of each chicken in that Purdue factory is much less than your friend's. But I think we would all acknowledge that the life of those chickens is terrible. So the question I have is, how dense is too dense when it comes to cities?
Now I see where you're going. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, for me, New York City was too dense. For my kids, it's just right. So I think it's different for different people. But I don't know. There definitely is too dense. I think though I don't think we're good at identifying what we actually like about our lives very much. And I think if you're young and underpaid and living in New York City, you have an unlimited number of activities and interesting things to do culturally, alcoholically, I mean, any number of things. If you are young and underpaid and living in the suburbs, you're basically at home looking at a box because you don't have the leverage to go out and do things. So I think it's partly there are issues of perception, and we need to work on those and how as we try to figure out what we value. You actually see it, I think, with some older people who are seeing the value in urban density, but then that comes with a negative too, which is that let's just assume that it all works and everybody decides they ought to live in a city. You don't want to simply engineer the reverse of suburban flight from the 1950s, where all the people with any money flee the city and move to the suburbs, leaving the people who are too poor to flee in the cities. You don't want to just do the opposite and push a city's poor out to the suburbs, to the houses abandoned by the people who've gone broke in the most far-flung and lost their houses in the most far-flung suburbs. It's just moving the ghetto to the suburbs is not it doesn't leave you anywhere better off.
I think it's already happening.
Yeah, right. Right. Well, it may be.
Why wouldn't that? Because the poor are always going to be dependent upon the intellectual and manufacturing production of these dense areas. So it seems to me it's almost patriotic to remove people from these vast exovia conditions and foster density. There's always going to be grades of density.
Yeah. Right. Maybe it is. Yeah, it could be.
The how dense is too dense. I don't have my figures exactly right, but I remember reading something about the failed idea of the planned urban developments, the PUDs, and that if Los Angeles is something like 6 or 8 people per acre, and New York is 200 people per acre, it only would have taken about a density of about 20 people per acre to make mass transit work. So the fact is that it doesn't have to all be at the density of Manhattan. And there are ways that you could just up the density enough that mass transit could have survived. And And the idea of just shrinking the average American living space a certain percentage has huge impacts. So I don't really think it's about everyone living at the density of Manhattan or London or Calcutta. It's about being a lot smarter in the way that we plan things. Now, unfortunately, we've invested, we had a really good run here, a good 100 years, 150 years, and we took all of our wealth and invested it in the wrong thing. And now we're sort of stuck with an infrastructure that may end up with the ghettos in the exurbs and the wealthy living in the center. And I'm not going to take a position, but I can't wait to hear that conversation a little more. But I think that it's I think that's one of the critical issues. A couple years ago, I was in China, and it was my first time. It was 6 or 7 years. It was my first time there, and I was in Beijing. And I was sort of shocked at how, with everything that we've learned, that they copied Los Angeles as the sort of urban model.
It's not Dubai, right?
Right. And I was interviewed on CCTV, and with Rui interviewed me. And so, they said, "What do you think of Beijing as an architect, a well-known architect who's here?" And I said, "Well, it's fantastic. It's what a great place, what a great culture. I'm just shocked that you didn't sort of learn from all the mistakes that we made. Like, we're dead. We're done as a civilization. The United States is over. You guys are ascendant. And if you had just sort of made a couple little tweaks, you could have kicked our ass that much faster," in nicer words, as kind of what I said. And the next day we were watching CCTV, and I came up, and they've got me interviewing. Of course, I'm dubbed in Chinese, and I asked the interviewer, who's an actual mutual friend of ours, "So what am I saying?" And he's saying that, "You're saying how beautiful, what a brilliant idea the party did to brilliantly plan the city in such an incredible way." And, I just kind of realized, well, okay, that's it. And it's not that we're getting any better information here than they're getting there about density and its kind of real, true effects, and why books like this, I think, are so important.
It's also, in addition to, it's not just, there's definitely bad density in what's been called density sprawl. Even more important than having a sufficient number of people is having a sufficient number of destinations and close together. The great thing about Manhattan is that you walk, it's within the nearest walking destination to my house in Connecticut is 150 yards away. It's my mailbox. When we lived in Manhattan, within 150 yards of the front door of our apartment building, there were 2 grocery stores, a specialty vegetable store, a shoe repair store, and even try to find one of those outside of the city, a liquor store, a hardware store, a movie theater, and probably 10,000 people to make all those things possible. And I think it is true that 20 people is about right. I think it's seven households per acre, something like that. However, there are advantages to going beyond that level of density, and I think you see it in New York and not really any place else in the United States, which is that once you, it's sometimes used as an argument for not making places denser. You watch transit use, it rises to a certain point and then it levels off. And it's well, that's the point where you only have to get that dense and that's where you stop, because after that you're not gaining anything. But actually, as you go beyond that point, what you get is you get people to whom public transit seems like an inefficient way to get around, and they simply walk. So the ideal, I think, is not to cross the threshold where transit becomes economically rational, but to push beyond it and get to the point where walking becomes the main way you go from place to place. And that's requires more people and more destinations piled on top of each other. But it's much, much harder to achieve.
I just want to make a quick note that I just came back from Beijing, where I tried to go for a run. And the mixed use has been taken to the level where manufacturing and residential are right next to each other. And literally, I had to turn around because the solvent smells were so strong from the manufacturing plants, of which there are residential buildings right next to it. So part of what has made New York so livable is that we've exported the manufacturing.
Yes. No, it's true. In this country, the reason our environmental balance sheet looks pretty decent or better than it used to is that we have moved everything, all our bad outputs to Asia.
Can I just, on the how dense is too dense question, I mean, Julian, because you and I have talked about this before. I think what's critical here is to understand the costs of being a free-range human, in your terminology, right? Right. Because the fact is that you know, I don't think anyone here would say it should somehow be illegal for someone to have a lawn, right? The question is whether they're paying the true cost of having that lawn, right? Because if you believe in a market-based choice system, if the true cost came through to people of having their car and having their lawn, if they had to pay for the environmental remediation associated with all of that, right, then I think you would find people saying, this isn't dense enough, very, very quickly.
That's what you're talking about too with smart
Yeah,
metering.
Yeah.
exactly. It's the metering consumption,
Yes,
and it's taking that to a much greater scale.
yeah.
But is a gallon of gasoline $4 or $35 when you put the military budget into
Yeah,
it?
absolutely.
Right? I mean, if that would really change
Right.
things.
Deborah, do you have a question? No, Levi?
So, Dave, I like your story about like the Portland locavores,
Oh, huh?
and every locavore is using, is driving 50 miles. I'm wondering, how do you compare? You've kind of started to speak about this with Asia. How do you compare this to just kind of global trade and our energy use in terms of relying on other countries to do our manufacturing, shipping goods back over?
Well, it's tough. If our goal is efficiency, then then it makes sense to do things in the places where it's most efficient to do them, and then move the products to other places. You wouldn't argue that we should only drive, locally produced hybrid automobiles or anything like that. But there are consequences. There are other consequences of that too, and how they all sort out. I don't know. There's also regarding those chickens, there is the factory food problem and the local consumption problem are different problems, and they don't have one solution. And I think we need, if we're going to feed ourselves at a level, at a cost that we can afford to feed ourselves, we require some solution that is we need to get efficiently produce food that isn't on our consciences, and that's hard to do. I think the easiest thing, if you want to shrink your carbon footprint, if you haven't done it already, is to become a vegetarian, which I have not done, and even despite having reclassified bacon as a vegetable, I haven't been able to do it. But reducing the amount of meat in the diet has a huge impact, not only on carbon and energy, but also on all these sort of hovering moral questions that go along with how we eat.
Yeah. In the black.
To me, it's maybe a tad too simplistic. It's the out in the country is evil and dense in the city is great. I was wondering whether it has to do that the discussion was mostly about carbon footprint and not any other metrics. Even for things like buying local, I don't think that's necessarily a carbon footprint issue, or the preferring heating oil over a wood fire is certainly not a carbon footprint issue, but it's another metric. So I was just wondering, are there other sustainability metrics where maybe living out in the country and providing eco-diversity, et cetera, is better than the city, that have to be taken into account to give more? Is it health or water use, or people smell more when they live more closely together and that's why they take more showers? I have no idea, but.
Yeah, there are obviously the issue is more complicated than just A or B, and yet I think unavoidably increase our environmental impact as we move farther apart from one another, and in terms of eco-diversity, our presence isn't required for that in the wild places. And I think there's a question of, we talk about the importance of our children, for example, having direct contact with the natural world, but I think there's a question of how much contact with us the natural world is able to sustain. So I don't know, I think they're complicated, but I think in terms of if we want to shrink down our impact, we also have to shrink down our sphere of influence. We tend to, when we think about these things, we tend to think, we look at like my flight to Australia. We tend to think, how can we make airplanes, my round trip to Australia, I was responsible, my share of the fuel burned on that flight was equal to the energy consumed by the average human being in a year, the average, that one flight. When we think about that, we tend to think, well, maybe we can run the airplanes on vegetable oil, maybe we can make the fuselage more efficient, we can change the design of the wings, we have computer systems that we can make, flight paths more efficient. But all these things, the jet I flew in was 75% more efficient than the first jets in the 1960s. We've already made all these things about as efficient as we can make them, and the main consequence of that has been to just drive down the cost of what we do and to make it more appealing. To fly to Australia in the late 1950s, it was a propeller plane. There were required stops between New York and Melbourne. It was stop in San Francisco, Hawaii, Fiji, some other island, someplace else. It cost something like a quarter of U.S. Income, median household income, U.S. median income that year, one way. Nowadays, you can fly from New York to Melbourne for $600, $700, or free by redeeming miles. And the main disincentive to doing it is the sort of the perceived unpleasantness of spending a whole day watching movies and sleeping in a padded reclining seat. So the issue is not that our machines are wasteful. The issue is that we've made them so unwasteful that we don't even think about using them. So it's tough to come at these problems from the efficiency direction. I think it's a kind of a tragedy of the commons issue. It makes absolutely perfect sense, and I spend a lot of time thinking about how do I make my life, how do I become more efficient in my own life? But as we do it collectively, it has the sort of the opposite effect.
One last question. Eric?
So to kind of flip Julian's question around, I think about, how dense is dense enough, not so much how dense is too dense, or, so in New York, when people talk about the great neighborhoods, a lot of people talk about places like Soho, the West Village, Tribeca, Carnegie Hill. They're not the densest places in New York City. If all of the U.S. was living in places that were as dense as the places that are great in New York, is that good enough?
Well, yeah, here.
I think by a factor of 5, it's probably enough to have a major impact. But not to say that that's the limit that we should go, but already, all right, sorry. I don't think it's only because they're not quite as dense as other parts of their great neighborhoods. I think it's more a kind of time issue is when those neighborhoods got developed, how the city was evolving in that time. Because 25 years ago, those were not the best places to live in the city, and we're seen as kind of like, well, you can live down there, but you can't walk to a grocery store, right, and other issues. So it's not exactly just because they're not quite as dense. But even if everyone lived at that density, I think that would make a dramatic impact on the country and the health of the world.
We'll never know because we'll never see it.
That's right.
Well, look, I think it's important to understand, I think it's a very good question in terms of understanding, we talk about 7 billion people, and there's all this kind of hysteria around the number of people there are in the world and where are they all going to go, and, the people who live on the planet, if they lived at the density of New York City, all 5 boroughs, not just Manhattan, but including the density of Staten Island, of all sorts of parts of Brooklyn, which is quite low, right? You mix that all together, and all of us take up the land that's occupied by Texas, with the rest of the world untouched, right? And so that's pretty extraordinary, right? Given that, you know, we have this kind of hysteria about the number of people there are on the planet and how much, you know, they're consuming in terms of land, right? The problem is we're just far, far too spread out. My short answer to Eric's question is that that would be just fine. That's it.
And no one would have time to consume energy because we'd all be like Homer with Bart, just like at each other's throats the whole time, right on top of each
Or
other.
maybe if we're on top of each other, we'd have to figure out a way to not do that to
Right.
each other. So,
Maybe we would.
anyway.
So I very much want to thank David for coming today. I wish he hadn't driven here, but I'm very much thank you. All right, I'm very, very glad he came. And it was great to put a face and an idea, a sensibility, I guess, to the book that we all read. Charlotte, Greg, my friends and colleagues, thank you very much. You added a lot of color to the evening. Thank you for coming tonight, and we'll see you soon.